On a cold February afternoon in 2009, a 28-year-old man walked out of Evin Prison in Tehran, Iran. He had spent 10 days in solitary confinement. His family waited outside the gates, relief flooding through them as they saw him emerge, thin and shaken, but alive. They drove him home. They fed him. They watched him sleep. And 3 days later, on February 16, 2009, Saeed Zainali left his family's apartment to run a simple errand. He never came back. No phone call, no ransom demand, no body, no arrest record, no explanation. For 15 years, his family has searched. They've filed reports, pleaded with authorities, contacted human rights organizations, and waited by the phone. The Iranian government has offered them nothing, not confirmation, not denial, just silence. But here's what makes this case particularly haunting. Saeed didn't just vanish into thin air. He vanished after the state had already detained him once and let him go. He vanished in a country where disappearances follow patterns, where detention centers keep records, where even the worst outcomes eventually surface. And yet, with Saeed, there's been nothing. It's as if those 3 days of freedom between his release and his disappearance were a cruel intermission in a play that never reached its final act. What happened to Saeed Zainali? Was he taken again by the same forces that had arrested him? Did he flee and meet with foul play? Or does his absence serve a purpose that requires his existence to remain permanently uncertain? The questions multiply, but the answers remain locked behind walls that won't speak. This is the story of a man who was arrested, released, and then erased. Who was Saeed Zainali? Before he became a case file, before he became a symbol, before he became a ghost, Saeed Zainali was a young man trying to build a life in one of the most politically volatile periods in modern Iranian history. Born in 1981 in Tehran, Saeed grew up in a middle-class family during the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that shaped an entire generation of Iranians. His childhood was marked by the contradictions of post-revolutionary Iran, a society rebuilding itself while maintaining strict ideological control, a place where ambition and conformity existed in constant tension. Those who knew Saeed describe him as intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply curious about the world beyond Iran's borders. He was the kind of young man who asked questions, who read widely, who wanted to understand systems and structures. He studied computer engineering, a field that attracted many young Iranians seeking practical skills in an economy increasingly dependent on technology. But Saeed's interests extended beyond technical knowledge. He was also politically aware, though not in the way that word might suggest to Western ears. He wasn't a radical. He wasn't organizing protests or writing manifestos. He was simply part of a generation that had grown up questioning the contradictions they witnessed daily, the gap between official narratives and lived reality, between the promise of the revolution and the constraints of the present. Friends remember him as someone who engaged carefully with political discussions, who weighed his words, who understood that in Iran, even casual conversation about politics could carry consequences. He wasn't reckless, he was cautious. But he was also curious, and in Iran in the late 2000s, curiosity itself could be dangerous. Saeed's social circle was typical for educated young people in Tehran: university friends, former classmates, people who gathered in cafes and private homes to talk about everything from software development to cinema to the state of the nation. These weren't organized political cells. They were informal networks of people navigating the same complex landscape, trying to figure out how to live authentically in a society where authenticity itself was policed. By his late 20s, Saeed was working in the tech sector, contributing to Iran's growing IT industry. He lived with his family in Tehran, as many young Iranians did, navigating the economic realities that made independent living difficult for most people his age. He maintained close relationships with his parents and siblings, who describe him as a devoted son and brother. There was no indication in early 2009 that Saeed was in danger. He wasn't a known activist. He hadn't published political writings. He wasn't affiliated with opposition groups. On the surface, his life looked unremarkable. Work, family, friends, the ordinary rhythms of urban existence. But in Iran, the surface rarely tells the whole story. And in early February 2009, something shifted. Something drew the attention of security forces to this quiet young computer engineer. What exactly that was remains unclear even now, but the consequences were about to unfold with devastating speed. The world around him, Iran, in 2009. To understand what happened to Saeed Zainali, you have to understand the Iran he lived in. This wasn't just any moment in Iranian history. This was the calm before one of the most significant political upheavals the Islamic Republic had faced since the 1979 revolution. The year 2009 would become synonymous with the Green Movement, the massive wave of protests that erupted after the disputed presidential election in June. Millions took to the streets across Iran, challenging the announced victory of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and demanding accountability, transparency, and reform. The government's response was brutal: mass arrests, torture, show trials, and killings. The names of victims like Nedega Sultan became symbols of state violence. But Saeed disappeared in February, 4 months before the election. He vanished during the period of rising tension that preceded the explosion, when security forces were already preparing for potential unrest, when intelligence agencies were already identifying and monitoring individuals they considered threats to stability. This context is crucial. The Iranian security apparatus in early 2009 was in a state of heightened alert. The Intelligence Ministry, the Revolutionary Guard's intelligence organization, and various other security entities were actively working to identify and neutralize what they perceived as networks of Western-backed infiltration and sedition. There was a pervasive sense among hardliners that outside forces, particularly the United States and European powers, were funding and organizing civil society groups to destabilize the Islamic Republic from within. This paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Western governments had indeed expressed support for civil society development in Iran, and some funding had flowed to Iranian organizations and individuals for human rights documentation, media training, and cultural exchange. But the Iranian government's response was wildly disproportionate, treating virtually any contact with foreign organizations or individuals as evidence of espionage. Young, educated Iranians like Saeed, especially those in the tech sector with international connections or English language skills, were particularly vulnerable to suspicion. The regime viewed the Internet as both an opportunity and a threat. While Iran's tech industry was growing, providing jobs and economic development, it also facilitated communication with the outside world and exposure to ideas that challenged official narratives. Tehran itself in 2009 was a city of contradictions. Its northern districts, where wealthier families lived, had a cosmopolitan atmosphere: cafes, art galleries, women pushing the boundaries of mandatory hijab regulations, young people finding spaces for social freedom. The southern districts were more conservative, more closely aligned with the government's ideology, though poverty and frustration crossed all neighborhoods. Evin Prison, where Saeed would spend 10 days in February, loomed both literally and figuratively over the city. Located in the northern foothills, this notorious facility had housed political prisoners since the 1970s. Under the Islamic Republic, it became synonymous with torture, forced confessions, and executions. The mere mention of Evin could silence a conversation. The prison had several sections. Ward 209 was controlled by the Intelligence Ministry. Ward 240 belonged to the Revolutionary Guards. Ward 2A was known for holding dissidents and political prisoners. Within these wards were interrogation cells, solitary confinement units, and communal cells. Former prisoners have described systematic torture, psychological pressure, and complete isolation from the outside world. Being taken to Evin meant entering a space where normal rules didn't apply, where detainees could be held incommunicado for months, where confessions were extracted through whatever means necessary. Families often had no idea where their loved ones were whether they were alive, or what charges they faced. The legal system provided minimal protections, and lawyers were frequently denied access to clients for extended periods. This was the environment Saeed Zainali was navigating in early 2009. A society on edge. A security state expanding its reach. A city where disappearances happened but were rarely acknowledged. And somewhere in this landscape, something he did or someone he knew or some connection he had drew the attention of forces that would first arrest him, then release him, then erase him entirely. The days leading up to the first arrest. The exact sequence of events leading to Saeed's first arrest in early February 2009 remains partially obscured. What we know comes from family accounts, human rights documentation, and the fragmented timeline that emerged after his disappearance. In January 2009, Saeed was living his normal life. He went to work, he saw friends, he helped his family with daily tasks. There were no obvious signs of surveillance or threats, at least none that he mentioned to his family. But in retrospect, there were contexts that may have made him vulnerable. Saeed had contacts in Iran's civil society sector, loose networks of activists, journalists, and intellectuals who documented human rights abuses and discussed political reform. These weren't formal organizations. They were informal connections, the kind that developed naturally among educated young people interested in social issues. Some of these individuals had received small grants or training from international human rights organizations. Others had attended conferences abroad or participated in online forums. In the Iranian security apparatus's worldview, these activities constituted evidence of a soft war against the Islamic Republic, an effort to undermine the government through cultural infiltration rather than military force. We don't know if Saeed himself had received any foreign funding or training. What matters is that people he knew might have, and in Iran's surveillance state, association could be as damning as action. The security services used sophisticated social network analysis, mapping relationships to identify not just activists, but their broader circles of contact. In the weeks before his arrest, Iran's security forces were conducting sweeps. They were arresting journalists, activists, and academics in what appeared to be a preemptive strike against potential organizing ahead of the presidential election. Many of these arrests were quiet, conducted without warrants, with detainees held for days or weeks before families were even informed. Saeed may have known some of the people being arrested. He may have heard warnings from friends. But if he did, he didn't flee. He stayed in Tehran, continuing his routine, perhaps believing he had nothing to fear because he had done nothing wrong. This is a pattern common to many victims of political detention, the belief that innocence provides protection, that the system, however flawed, ultimately distinguishes between real threats and ordinary citizens. It's a belief that doesn't survive contact with a security state operating under threat perception rather than evidence. On or around February 5, 2009, security forces came for Saeed Zainali. We don't know the exact time or location of his arrest. Was he taken from his home in the early morning, the classic knock on the door before dawn? Was he picked up on the street, perhaps near his workplace? Was he summoned for questioning and then detained? Family accounts don't specify, and the government has never acknowledged the arrest officially. What we know is that he was taken to Evin prison, and that he would spend the next 10 days in a place where time itself becomes a weapon. 10 days in Evin. The first detention, solitary confinement in Evin prison, follows a carefully calibrated routine of disorientation and psychological pressure. Former prisoners have described the process in detail, and while we can't know Saeed's exact experience, the pattern is consistent enough to reconstruct what likely happened. When detainees arrive at Evin, they're typically blindfolded. They're led through corridors designed to disorient, where sounds echo and footsteps multiply. They're strip-searched, their belongings confiscated. They're given prison uniforms, simple, often ill-fitting clothes that erase individuality. Then they're taken to their cells. Solitary cells in Evin vary in size but share common features. They're small, often barely large enough to lie down in. There's a thin mattress or blanket on the floor, a toilet in the corner, sometimes without privacy, a single light bulb that may be kept on 24 hours a day or turned off for extended periods, no windows, no clock, no way to mark time except by meal deliveries and the calls to prayer that sometimes filter through the walls. The isolation is total. Days blur into nights. Sleep deprivation is common, either from the constant light or from guards who wake detainees at irregular intervals. Meals arrive sporadically, not always at the same times each day, further disrupting any sense of routine. Interrogations can happen at any time. Sometimes detainees are questioned multiple times a day. Sometimes they're left alone for days, the waiting itself becoming a form of torture. The interrogators, usually members of the intelligence ministry or Revolutionary Guards, have files, lists of names, transcripts of phone calls, printouts of emails. The extent of the surveillance becomes clear during these sessions. They know who you called, where you went, what you said. The questions focus on associations. Who do you know? What organizations have you been in contact with? Have you received money from abroad? Have you attended meetings? The interrogators often have specific answers they want. They're not looking to gather information as much as to confirm existing narratives. They want confessions that fit predetermined patterns of sedition and foreign infiltration. Physical torture in Evan has been extensively documented. Beatings, stress positions, mock executions, sexual assault. But psychological torture is just as common and sometimes more effective. Threats against family members. Promises of leniency followed by withdrawal of those promises. False information about co-detainees who have supposedly confessed. The manipulation of hope and fear. For 10 days, this was Saeed's world. We don't know what he was asked or what he said. We don't know if he was physically harmed or if the pressure was purely psychological. We don't know if he was accused of specific crimes or simply questioned about his associations. What we know is that after 10 days, something changed. A decision was made. And on February 13th, 2009, Saeed Zainali was released. The release, 3 days of freedom. When Saeed walked out of Evan prison on February 13, 2009, his family was waiting. The relief was overwhelming. In Iran, where detention can stretch into months or years, where prisoners sometimes never emerge, 10 days felt like a miracle. But relief was mixed with fear. Released prisoners in Iran often come out changed, traumatized, paranoid, or broken. Some are forced to sign agreements pledging not to discuss their detention or engage in political activities. Some are released only to be rearrested later. Release doesn't necessarily mean freedom. Sometimes it means you're being watched to see where you lead them. Saeed's family noticed he was quiet, thinner. He didn't talk much about what had happened inside. This isn't unusual. Former prisoners often struggle to articulate their experiences, especially to loved ones they don't want to burden or frighten. The psychological impact of solitary confinement can include difficulty with social interaction, paranoia, and depression. But he was home. He ate meals with his family. He slept in his own bed. For 3 days, they tried to return to normal, though normal had been irrevocably disrupted. What Saeed did during those 3 days, who he contacted, what he was thinking, these details are sparse. Did he call friends to let them know he was okay? Did he try to resume work? Did he consider leaving Iran? Some released prisoners do flee the country immediately, understanding that detention can be a prelude to more serious charges. They make their way to Turkey or Iraqi Kurdistan, seeking asylum in third countries. But fleeing requires resources, planning, and often connections to smuggling networks. It means leaving family behind. It means admitting that home is no longer safe. There's no evidence Saeed was planning to flee. Perhaps he believed his release meant the matter was closed. Perhaps he thought he had convinced his interrogators of his innocence. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that worse was yet to come. On February 16, 2009, 3 days after his release, Saeed told his family he needed to run an errand. The accounts don't specify what errand. Some sources say he was going to meet a friend, others that he was going to handle some administrative task. It was an ordinary moment, the kind of casual departure that happens thousands of times a day in every city in the world. His family expected him back that evening. He didn't come home. They waited. The hours passed. Night fell. They called his phone. No answer. They called friends. No one had seen him. By the next morning, panic had set in. They began retracing his steps, calling everyone he might have contacted. Nothing. They went to the police to file a missing person report. And here, they encountered the first wall of official indifference that would characterize the next 15 years. The second disappearance. When reality fractures. When a person disappears in Iran, families face a labyrinth of bureaucracy, jurisdiction disputes, and deliberate obstruction. Different security forces operate independently. The intelligence ministry, the Revolutionary Guards, the police, the judiciary. Each claims authority over different types of cases, and none are obligated to share information with the others or with families. Saeed's family went to the police first. They filed a missing person report, but the police response was tepid at best. There was no immediate search, no public appeal for information, no investigation that the family could see. Why? Because the police likely knew or suspected what the family was beginning to realize, that Saeed's disappearance wasn't an ordinary missing person case. It was almost certainly connected to his earlier detention. When someone who has recently been released from Evin prison disappears, the logic is straightforward. The security forces have taken them again. Either they found new evidence, or they decided the original detention didn't achieve its purpose, or they want to send a message. But here's where Saeed's case deviates from the typical pattern. Usually, when security forces rearrest someone, there's eventually some acknowledgement. The family is informed, even if not immediately. The detainee appears in court eventually, even if after months. Charges are filed. Even in show trials with predetermined outcomes, there's a process. With Saeed, there was nothing. His family began the agonizing work of searching. They contacted every government agency they could think of. They went to Evin prison, asking if Saeed had been returned there. Prison officials claimed no knowledge of him. They contacted the intelligence ministry. No response. The Revolutionary Guards. Silence. The prosecutor's office. Nothing. They hired lawyers, but lawyers in Iran have limited power in security cases. If a detainee is held under national security charges, lawyers can be denied access for months. If the security forces don't acknowledge holding someone, there's no legal case to pursue. International human rights organizations became involved. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and various Iranian human rights groups in exile began documenting Saeed's case. They published reports, issued appeals, and added his name to growing lists of forcibly disappeared individuals in Iran. But these efforts yielded no new information. The Iranian government didn't respond to international pressure. Domestically, Saeed's family was careful about how publicly they pushed. In Iran, families of disappeared persons face a terrible dilemma: speak out and risk becoming targets themselves, or stay silent and watch the case fade from memory. Months passed, then years. Saeed's family continued filing appeals, continued checking with authorities, continued hoping for any information. Even the worst information would be better than not knowing. Other families in similar situations have described the psychological torture of uncertainty. Is your loved one alive? Are they being tortured? Have they been executed? Should you hope or should you grieve? The inability to perform funeral rites, to mourn properly, to achieve any kind of closure, this is its own form of cruelty, and the questions multiplied. If security forces had rearrested Saeed, why was there no record? Why no charges? Why no acknowledgement whatsoever? Iran's security apparatus, for all its opacity, usually leaves some trace. Prisoners may be held incommunicado, but they exist within the system. Their detention is documented somewhere, unless the point is precisely that there be no documentation. Unless the disappearance itself serves a purpose that acknowledgement would undermine. Theories and possibilities. What happened to Saeed Zainali? 15 years after Saeed's disappearance, several theories have emerged about what happened to him. None can be definitively proven, but each deserves careful consideration based on the evidence available and patterns observed in other cases. Theory 1. He was rearrested and died in custody. This is perhaps the most straightforward explanation. Security forces took Saeed into custody again on February 16, 2009. During interrogation or detention, something went wrong. Perhaps he was tortured and died from his injuries. Perhaps he took his own life in despair. Perhaps he suffered a medical emergency that wasn't treated. In such scenarios, the authorities might choose to hide the death rather than acknowledge it. Admitting a detainee died in custody creates problems. Investigations, international condemnation, family lawsuits. It's simpler to make the person disappear entirely. This theory is supported by documented cases of deaths in Iranian custody that were covered up or explained away with false narratives. The security apparatus has both the capability and the motive to make bodies disappear. However, there are problems with this theory. First, the complete absence of any record is unusual. Even in death in custody cover-ups, some documentation typically exists somewhere in the system. Second, the timing is strange. If they wanted to continue interrogating Saeed, why release him only to rearrest him 3 days later? Why not simply keep him in detention? Theory 2. He was executed similar to the previous theory, but with a more deliberate endpoint. Perhaps during his first detention, Saeed was deemed a serious enough threat to warrant execution, but the authorities decided to release him first to reduce suspicion, then pick him up again and carry out the sentence. Iran has conducted secret executions of political prisoners, particularly during periods of heightened tension. Bodies are often not returned to families or are buried in unmarked graves. Families may receive no notification or may be told years later that their loved one was executed. This theory would explain the total absence of Saeed after February 16th. But it doesn't explain why the government, which has acknowledged other executions, sometimes years after the fact, has never acknowledged Saeed's fate. Even in cases of secret executions, information sometimes emerges through former prisoners, leaked documents, or eventual government admissions. Theory 3. He's alive in permanent secret detention. Some victims of enforced disappearance in Iran remain in permanent detention without any legal process. They're held in secret facilities, sometimes moved between locations, kept alive but completely cut off from the outside world. Why would the state do this? Several reasons. Perhaps Saeed had information the authorities wanted to extract slowly over time. Perhaps he was being used to pressure others, his existence as a bargaining chip even if his family doesn't know he's alive. Perhaps he's being held as leverage in case he's needed for a prisoner exchange or political negotiation in the future. This theory is supported by accounts from former prisoners who have described meeting detainees who had been held for years without any legal process, their families unaware they were even alive. But it requires believing the authorities saw sufficient value in keeping Saeed specifically in this state of limbo for 15 years, which seems unlikely for someone who wasn't a high-profile activist. Theory 4. He fled and met with foul play. Perhaps Saeed's detention frightened him badly enough that he decided to flee Iran, but he didn't tell his family to protect them. He might have contacted smugglers to help him cross the border. But something went wrong during the escape attempt. He was caught and killed by border guards, or he was robbed and killed by the smugglers themselves, or he had an accident in the difficult terrain along Iran's borders. This would explain why there's no record within the Iranian detention system. But it doesn't explain why he never contacted his family afterward. Even refugees who flee without telling their families usually find a way to send word once they're safe. Additionally, there's no evidence Saeed had the resources or connections to arrange an escape on such short notice. Theory 5. The disappearance was intentional as a message. This is perhaps the darkest theory. The Iranian security apparatus sometimes uses enforced disappearance not just to neutralize individuals but to terrorize communities. The uncertainty itself, the not knowing, serves as a warning to others. By taking Saeed, releasing him, and then making him vanish completely without acknowledgement, the authorities send a message. We can do this to anyone, at any time, and there will be no consequences, no accountability, no answers. The fear spreads beyond Saeed's immediate circle to anyone who might consider activism or dissent. This theory is supported by the pattern of enforced disappearances in Iran and other authoritarian states. Uncertainty is a weapon. The inability to grieve or achieve closure is a form of ongoing punishment for families who might otherwise become activists themselves. But it requires accepting a level of calculated cruelty that, while documented in state security operations, is difficult to reconcile with individual human psychology. Somewhere, individuals made decisions about Saeed. They wrote reports, or chose not to. They decided what to tell their superiors. They went home to their own families. The bureaucracy of cruelty is banal, but it's still human. The investigation that never was. In most missing person cases, there's an investigation. Police interview witnesses, check surveillance footage, trace phone records, search locations. Even when cases go cold, there's usually evidence that official efforts were made. With Saeed Zainali, there was no meaningful investigation, at least not one visible to the family or documented in any accessible records. The police accepted the missing person report but took no observable action. There were no public appeals for information, no search parties, no interviews with Saeed's friends or colleagues, no analysis of his phone records or bank accounts. This absence is itself telling. In an ordinary disappearance, even in Iran, police would follow basic procedures. The lack of investigation suggests they knew or were told that this wasn't an ordinary case, that it was a security matter beyond their jurisdiction. The family attempted to pursue legal remedies. They filed complaints with the judiciary, seeking an investigation into their son's whereabouts. These complaints were either ignored or rejected on procedural grounds. When families of disappeared persons try to use the legal system, they often hit a wall of circular logic. They're told they can't file a complaint without evidence of wrongdoing, but they can't gather evidence without official cooperation. Lawyers who took on Saeed's case faced their own obstacles. In national security cases, lawyers can be denied access to files, barred from court proceedings, or even arrested themselves for being too aggressive in defending clients. The legal system in Iran has processes and procedures, but in politically sensitive cases, these processes often serve to legitimize predetermined outcomes rather than seek justice. International human rights organizations documented Saeed's case and included it in broader reports about enforced disappearances in Iran. These reports detailed patterns: the targeting of young educated Iranians, particularly those with any foreign contacts, the practice of detention without charge, the use of solitary confinement and torture, the denial of legal representation, and the complete lack of accountability when detainees die or disappear. But international pressure has limited impact on Iran's security apparatus. The government routinely dismisses such reports as Western propaganda. UN special rapporteurs on human rights in Iran are denied entry to the country. International criminal courts have no jurisdiction. Economic sanctions don't target the specific individuals responsible for disappearances. The investigation, such as it was, came from outside Iran. Researchers compiled timelines, verified facts with sources who could speak anonymously, and preserved evidence in case future accountability mechanisms ever emerge. But this research couldn't answer the fundamental question: where is Saeed Zainali? Former prisoners have been debriefed after their release, but none reported seeing Saeed in Evin or any other detention facility. This either means he wasn't held in the facilities where these prisoners were, or he was held in sections so isolated that even other prisoners never encountered him, or he wasn't detained at all after February 16th. The digital trail went cold immediately. Saeed's phone went silent. There was no activity on any accounts, no financial transactions, no email or social media activity. In the modern age, this kind of complete digital disappearance is itself unusual. Even people who flee or go into hiding usually leave some trace. Every investigation needs leads, but Saeed's case had none. No witnesses to his disappearance, no confirmed last location, no suspect vehicle or person, just a young man who walked out his door and ceased to exist. The context: Iran's disappeared. Saeed Zainali is not an isolated case. He's one of potentially thousands of individuals who have been forcibly disappeared in Iran over the decades since the 1979 revolution. The practice has historical roots. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War and the consolidation of the Islamic Republic's power, thousands of political prisoners were executed in secret. The mass executions of 1988, when several thousand political prisoners were killed over a few months, remain one of the darkest chapters in modern Iranian history. Many of those executed were buried in unmarked graves. Families were given no information, sometimes for years. This established a pattern. The state could make people disappear, and there would be no consequences. The bodies might never be found. The families would never get answers, and the uncertainty would serve as a warning to others. In the decades since, the practice continued at a lower but steady rate. Activists, journalists, ethnic minority leaders, religious minorities, all have been targeted. Some eventually reappeared, often after years of detention. Others never did. The 2009 Green Movement protests led to a spike in disappearances. In the crackdown following the disputed election, thousands were arrested. Many were held in detention centers like Kahrizak, where conditions were so brutal that even the government eventually acknowledged abuses. Some detainees died. Others were released but psychologically destroyed, and some simply disappeared into the system, their families left to search in vain. Saeed disappeared 4 months before the Green Movement erupted, during the period of preparation when security forces were already moving against suspected organizers and foreign-backed infiltrators. He was part of a wave of preemptive detentions that received less attention because they happened before the mass protests that drew international media coverage. Human rights organizations have documented the mechanics of enforced disappearance in Iran. The practice typically follows certain patterns. Security forces, usually intelligence ministry or Revolutionary Guards, conduct arrests without warrants. Detainees are held incommunicado, often in secret facilities or isolated sections of known prisons. Families are given no information about where their loved ones are or what charges they face. Lawyers are denied access. Red Cross visits are refused. During detention, torture is common. Methods include beatings, stress positions, sleep deprivation, threats against family members, sexual abuse, and psychological torture. The goal is often to extract confessions that can be used in show trials or propaganda videos. Detainees are forced to confess to being spies, agents of foreign powers, or members of illegal organizations. Some detainees are eventually released, sometimes after forced public confessions. Others are sentenced in closed trials without proper legal representation, and others simply disappear, their fates unknown. The families of the disappeared face unique challenges. They can't grieve properly without a body. They can't move on with their lives because hope never completely dies. They face financial hardship if the disappeared person was a breadwinner. They face social stigma. In some communities, having a family member disappeared or imprisoned on political grounds can bring shame and isolation. And they face constant psychological warfare from the state. Sometimes officials hint that the disappeared person is alive. Sometimes they suggest the family should stop asking questions if they know what's good for them. Sometimes they offer false hope, claiming the person will be released soon if the family complies with demands. In Saeed's case, his family has received nothing. No threats, no hints, no false promises. Just an absolute wall of silence that has persisted for 15 years. This is almost worse than malicious communication. It suggests the authorities either don't know what happened to Saeed, unlikely, or don't care enough about his case to even bother with the usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation. The family's 15-year search for Saeed's family, February 16, 2009, was the beginning of a nightmare with no end. The first days were frantic searching. Then came weeks of bureaucratic appeals. Then months of waiting for responses that never came. Then years of quiet persistence, maintaining hope against an avalanche of silence. The family has had to navigate an impossible situation. If they stay silent, Saeed's case might be forgotten entirely, becoming one more name in a list that grows longer each year. But if they speak out too loudly, they risk becoming targets themselves, potentially endangering other family members. They've given interviews to international media, always careful in their language, always emphasizing that they just want to know what happened, not making political accusations even though the political nature of the case is obvious. This careful navigation is typical of families of the disappeared in authoritarian contexts. They have to advocate without antagonizing, demand answers without making demands. The psychological toll has been immense. Family members have described the experience as living in suspended animation. They can't grieve because they don't know if Saeed is dead. They can't celebrate his life because doing so feels like giving up hope. Every phone call might be the one that brings news. Every knock on the door might be him coming home. Every rumor of prisoner releases triggers hope that maybe, this time, he'll be among them. Anniversaries are particularly difficult. Saeed's birthday passes each year. He would be 43 now, if he's alive. The anniversary of his disappearance brings renewed media attention sometimes, but also renewed pain. Holidays that once brought family together now emphasize his absence. The family has reached out to former prisoners, hoping someone might have information. Some former detainees have tried to help, sharing what they know about Evan's internal structure, about which sections exist, about how the system works. But none have had information about Saeed specifically. They've followed other cases hoping to find patterns that might shed light on Saeed's situation. When other disappeared persons reappear, either released or confirmed dead, the family examines what happened, looking for clues. But Saeed's case remains distinctive in its complete absence of any resolution or information. Financial strain has added to emotional suffering. Saeed's potential earnings, his role in the family, the money spent on lawyers and appeals, all of this has taken a toll. Some families of the disappeared in Iran fall into poverty, particularly if the disappeared person was the primary earner. There's also the question of what to tell people. Neighbors, distant relatives, old friends who ask about Saeed. What do you say? The truth is too painful to repeat constantly, but lies feel like betrayal. Many families develop a simple, practiced response that provides minimal information and discourages follow-up questions. The family has had to watch Iran's political landscape shift while Saeed's case remains frozen. The Green Movement happened without him. A nuclear deal was negotiated, then abandoned. New presidents were elected. Protests erupted and were crushed. Life went on. The world moved forward, and Saeed remained disappeared, his case static while everything around it changed. International human rights organizations continue to list Saeed in their reports, but as years pass, cases inevitably get less attention. There are always new victims, new urgent cases, new crises demanding focus. Saeed's disappearance, now 15 years old, risks becoming historical rather than current, a case study rather than an active search. But for his family, every day is current. Every day is an active search. Every day is waiting for an answer that may never come. The silence that speaks. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Saeed Zainali's disappearance is the absolute silence that surrounds it. Iran's government, which has acknowledged other detentions, other trials, even other deaths in custody, has said nothing about Saeed. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just void. This silence is a statement. It says the state is not accountable to families. It says individuals can be erased without explanation. It says power includes the power to make people cease to exist in any official sense while their families live in perpetual uncertainty. There have been cases where the Iranian government eventually acknowledged what happened to disappeared persons, sometimes years or even decades later. In the 2000s, the government admitted to some of the executions from the 1980s, though without providing full accounting or access to burial sites. In some cases, families have received death certificates years after the fact, sometimes as bureaucratic accidents rather than intentional disclosure. But with Saeed, there's been nothing. No accidental revelation, no information leaked by sympathetic officials, no confirmation from former cellmates. The silence is comprehensive. This suggests several possibilities. Either the records of what happened to Saeed are so tightly controlled that no information has leaked despite 15 years passing, or there are no records to leak because his case was handled so far outside normal procedures that documentation doesn't exist, or the people who know what happened have reasons to maintain silence that outweigh any pressure to disclose. The silence also affects how we understand the case. Without official information, everything is speculation. We can develop theories based on patterns from other cases, but we can't know Saeed's specific circumstances. Was he accused of something specific? Was his detention connected to specific individuals or organizations? Was his fate decided by policy or by individual malice? The silence prevents understanding. For researchers and human rights advocates, silence is its own form of evidence. It demonstrates the total impunity enjoyed by Iran's security forces. It shows the weakness of legal and institutional safeguards. It reveals the extent to which families can be ignored without consequence. For the international community, silence makes intervention difficult. It's hard to advocate for someone when there's no acknowledgement they exist in state custody. How do you negotiate for release when no one admits to holding the person? How do you press for information when questions go completely unanswered? The silence also serves a purpose domestically. It allows different audiences to believe different things. Supporters of the government can assume Saeed was guilty of something serious, that the state had good reasons for whatever happened, that justice was served, even if quietly. Critics know the silence indicates wrongdoing, but without specifics, they can't build a coherent narrative of abuse. The ambiguity serves the state's interests. And for other young Iranians who might consider activism or even just association with civil society groups, the silence carries a message. This could happen to you, and no one would ever know what became of you. The uncertainty itself is the warning, where the case stands today. As of 2024, 15 years after Saeed Zainali disappeared, his case remains officially unresolved and unofficially forgotten by all but those who loved him and those who track such disappearances. The Iranian government has never issued any statement about Saeed. No charges have been filed in any court. No death certificate has been issued. No prisoner release lists have included his name. In the eyes of the state, Saeed Zainali simply doesn't exist as an active case. His family continues to seek information, though the passage of time has dimmed their hopes. They've filed repeated appeals with Iranian judicial authorities, all of which have gone unanswered or been rejected. They've contacted international human rights organizations, which continue to document the case but have no power to compel Iran to provide answers. There have been no new leads in years. No witnesses have come forward. No former prisoners have reported seeing him. No leaked documents have mentioned his name. The trail, cold from the beginning, has frozen solid. In 2024, Iran remains under an authoritarian government with the same security structures that existed in 2009. The Intelligence Ministry and Revolutionary Guards still operate with impunity. Enforced disappearances continue, though perhaps not at the same rate as during the most intense periods of repression. The mechanisms that allowed Saeed to disappear are still in place. International attention to Iran has focused on other issues: the nuclear program, regional conflicts, economic sanctions, more recent protest movements, and their violent suppression. Individual cases of disappeared persons struggle to maintain visibility in this broader context. Human rights organizations continue to include Saeed's case in their reports on enforced disappearances in Iran. His name appears on lists maintained by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and various Iranian human rights groups in exile. But these lists are long and growing longer. Individual cases blur together into statistics. The only real change in recent years has been the passage of time itself, which makes certain outcomes more likely and others less so. If Saeed was being held in secret detention, 15 years is an extraordinarily long time for that to continue with zero leaks. If he was alive, one might expect some trace evidence to have emerged: a sighting, a message, some indication. The absence of any such evidence doesn't prove he's dead, but it shifts the probabilities. For his family, the not knowing continues to be the worst part. They live in a state of ambiguous loss, grieving someone who might still be alive, hoping for someone who is probably dead. This psychological state has been studied in families of the disappeared worldwide. It's associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and complicated grief that can't resolve because there's no closure. The practical questions persist too. Should they hold a memorial service without a body? Should they legally declare him dead to settle financial matters? How do they honor his memory while maintaining hope? These aren't just emotional questions. They have legal and social implications. If there's any hope for resolution, it likely lies in political change in Iran. If the current government were to fall or reform significantly, archives might be opened, truth commissions might be established, perpetrators might face accountability. This happened in some other countries that transitioned from authoritarian rule to democracy: Argentina, Chile, South Africa. But Iran shows no signs of such transition, and even if it did, there's no guarantee records of Saeed's case were kept. The other possibility is that individual officials with knowledge might eventually speak. Former security personnel have occasionally defected and provided information about disappearances and executions. But such revelations are rare, and even when they happen, they tend to cover high-profile cases rather than individuals like Saeed, whose disappearances weren't widely known. So the case stands where it has stood for 15 years. Nowhere, no resolution, no answers, no justice. Just absence where a person used to be, the questions that remain. Why Saeed? Of all the young Iranians who had loose connections to civil society, who had educated, questioning minds, who moved in circles that might draw security attention, why did Saeed specifically end up disappeared? Was there something he did that we don't know about? Some meeting he attended, some document he signed, some connection he made that seemed innocuous to him but critical to security forces? Or was he simply unlucky, caught in a sweep? One name on a list generated by algorithmic analysis of social networks and communication patterns. What happened during those 10 days in Evan during his first detention? What was he asked? What did he say? Did he provide information about others? Did he refuse to cooperate? Did something occur during those interrogations that sealed his fate? Why was he released only to be disappeared again 3 days later? This pattern is unusual. If the authorities decided he was dangerous enough to warrant permanent detention or execution, why let him go first? Was the release a mistake? Was it intentional, designed to make his subsequent disappearance seem less like state action? Or did something happen during those 3 days that changed the calculation? Where did he actually go on February 16, 2009? His family says he left to run an errand, but what errand? Who might he have been planning to meet? Did he actually have a mundane appointment, or was there something else he wasn't telling his family? And at what point during that day did he encounter whatever force made him vanish? If he was redetained, where was he held? Evan has many sections, but it's not infinite. Other facilities exist, but they too have limits. If Saeed was held somewhere, why did no other prisoner ever report seeing him, even years later when they were released and could speak? Is he still alive? This is the question his family can't stop asking. After 15 years, the probability seems low, but it's not zero. There have been cases of political prisoners held for decades. There have been people who emerged from secret detention after being presumed dead. Hope refuses to die completely, even when logic suggests it should. If he's dead, how did he die? And where is his body? Iran has mass graves and unmarked burial sites, but it also has morgues and records. Bodies don't simply vanish. They're buried or cremated or disposed of somehow. Where is Saeed's body, if there is one? Who made the decisions about Saeed's fate? In any bureaucratic system, even secret police operations, there are decision points. Someone decided to arrest him. Someone decided to release him. Someone decided what happened next. Who were these people? Do they think about Saeed? Do they justify what they did as necessary for national security? Or have they forgotten him entirely? One case among thousands. Is there a file somewhere with answers? In government archives, in intelligence ministry records, in Revolutionary Guard databases. Does documentation exist that could explain what happened? Or was Saeed's case handled so far outside normal procedures that no paper trail remains? Could this have been prevented? If Saeed had fled Iran immediately after his first release, could he have escaped? If his family had made different choices, pushed harder, or pulled back, could the outcome have changed? Or was his fate sealed the moment security forces first identified him as a person of interest? What would justice look like at this point? 15 years later, what outcome could satisfy the family's need for truth and accountability? Return of remains? Prosecution of those responsible? Public acknowledgement of what happened? Or simply knowing, finally, definitively knowing, what became of their son and brother? And finally, the biggest question: how many others are there? How many people has Iran disappeared whose cases never became documented, whose families were too afraid to speak out, whose names appear on no international lists? Saeed's case is known because his family had the courage and resources to pursue it. But how many disappeared into the same silence without anyone to advocate for them? The weight of unknowing. There's a cruelty specific to enforced disappearance that other forms of violence don't quite match. Murder is final. There's pain and loss, but there's also closure. Imprisonment is unjust, but it's tangible. You know where the person is. Exile is separation, but communication is possible. Disappearance is none of these and all of these. It's the worst of every outcome combined with the certainty of none. It's perpetual grief that can't resolve. It's hope that tortures. It's loss without end. For Saeed's family, 15 years means 5,479 days of not knowing, of waking up each morning to the same question that has no answer, of seeing young men who look like Saeed might look now and wondering, of hearing about prisoners being released and checking the lists, of hearing about bodies being found and dreading while hoping for identification. It means missing Saeed at family gatherings, setting a place at the table that no one sits in but no one can bear to remove. It means explaining to children born after 2009 why there's a young man in family photos who isn't there anymore. It means watching Saeed's peers get married, have children, build careers, grow older, while Saeed remains frozen at 28, neither alive nor definitely dead. It means bargaining with fate and God and the universe. We'd rather know he's dead than not know at all. At least then we could grieve properly. At least then we could bury him and visit a grave and say prayers and move forward with our lives. The not knowing is worse than knowing the worst. But would it be? Or is hope, however painful, better than the finality of confirmed death? This is the impossible calculation families of the disappeared face. They live in both states simultaneously, assuming the worst while hoping for the best, grieving while remaining unable to complete grief. The disappearance has ripple effects beyond the immediate family. Friends who knew Saeed carry their own questions and guilt. Did they say something that led security forces to him? Should they have warned him more explicitly? Should they have stayed in touch after his first release? Those who shared Saeed's social circles had to decide whether to flee Iran themselves, whether their own associations made them targets. The broader community of activists and civil society workers learned from Saeed's case what could happen. The message was received. You can be erased, not just imprisoned, not just exiled, but made to cease existing in any official sense. Your family will have no recourse. International attention will be brief, and eventually you'll be forgotten by everyone except those who loved you. This is the strategic function of enforced disappearance. It's not primarily about the individual who disappears. It's about everyone who witnesses the disappearance and internalizes the lesson. This could be you, and there would be nothing anyone could do about it. 15 years is long enough that some people who knew Saeed have moved on with their lives. They've emigrated, changed careers, started families, survived Iran's economic crises and political upheavals. Saeed's disappearance is part of their past, a tragic memory, but not a current reality. This is natural and human and doesn't diminish the tragedy, but it does mean the circle of people actively thinking about Saeed shrinks each year. For his immediate family, moving on isn't an option. Every day is the day he might come home or the day news might finally arrive. They're trapped in February 2009, replaying those 3 days between his release and disappearance, wondering what they missed, what they could have done differently. And for Saeed himself, if he's still conscious somewhere, still alive in some cell in some facility, what has 15 years meant? How do you survive that? How do you maintain sanity in complete isolation for that long? How do you hold on to identity when the world has forgotten you exist? Or if he died in 2009, in those first days or weeks after his second disappearance, then 15 years is the measure of how long injustice can persist unacknowledged. 15 years during which whoever killed him or ordered his death faced no consequences. 15 years during which his body lay wherever it was disposed of, unclaimed and unmarked. 15 years during which his family's suffering served the interests of those who made him disappear. On February 16, 2009, Saeed Zainali left his family's apartment in Tehran to run an errand. He was 28 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He had dreams and fears and plans and relationships and all the complex texture that makes up a human life. 15 years later, we still don't know what that errand was. We don't know where he went. We don't know who he saw last. We don't know if he's alive or dead. We don't know if his disappearance was carefully planned or opportunistic. We don't know if it was about him specifically or if he was incidental to larger operations. We don't know if records exist somewhere or if his case was so irregular that nothing was documented. What we do know is that Saeed Zainali was a real person. He existed. He mattered to people. His absence has left a hole in the world that 15 years haven't filled. His family still waits for answers that may never come. And his case stands as a stark example of what states can do when they operate without accountability, when individuals can be erased, and families can be tormented with silence, and the world moves on because there are always new crises demanding attention. Somewhere, there's truth. Somewhere, someone knows what happened to Saeed Zainali. But whether that truth will ever emerge, whether his family will ever get answers, whether justice will ever touch his case, these questions remain as open as they were 15 years ago, and so the wait continues. The questions persist, the silence endures, and Saeed Zainali remains disappeared, neither confirmed dead nor provably alive, suspended in the cruel limbo of enforced disappearance where families can neither grieve nor hope without pain. If you're watching this and you have any information about Saeed Zainali's disappearance, any knowledge of what happened after February 16, 2009, please come forward. His family deserves to know. Truth, however painful, is better than this endless uncertainty. Saeed Zainali, arrested, released, then vanished forever. A name, a life, a question with no answer.